Hello, Year 9, and welcome back to Lesson 7 of the Living World topic. So you might feel like this is a slightly strange start to the lesson. There isn't a title, there aren't any objectives. I want you to guess what the title is. So there is a title in a few slides' time, which you'll be writing down, but which biome are we going to be looking at next? Which one would it be sensible for us to look at? We've had a look at deciduous forests or temperate broadleaf forests, which is the biome that the UK is in. We've looked at hot deserts, we've looked at the Mediterranean biome, and we've looked at the coral reef ecosystem, sometimes classified as part of the ocean biome, a large and important ecosystem. So where would it be sensible to investigate next? Okay, so going back to a few lessons ago when we spoke about what a biome is and how biomes might not necessarily appear how we would expect them to look. So the Amazon rainforest, the picture in the background is how we might expect the Amazon rainforest to look or how we might picture it, but the other pictures here are also the tropical rainforest biome. So we spoke about temperate forests and how the temperate forest biome might not always necessarily appear how we imagine or how we might think about. And the same with hot deserts as well. So Las Vegas is in the Mojave Desert in North America. That might surprise us. We might not necessarily think about Las Vegas when we think about a hot desert environment or a hot desert biome. So can you think of anywhere in the world, any other particular biomes that we haven't just spoken about now, anywhere in the world that might be different to how we possibly imagine it to be? Or are there any places that we might imagine and most of the landscape is actually like that? It hasn't been significantly influenced by human activity. A little bit of a clue. Where hasn't been influenced by human activity very much? Polar environments. So this lesson and your next 4 lessons will be all about polar environments. So your title for today's lesson is What is it like in Antarctica and the Arctic? Your lesson objectives are to investigate the difference between polar and tundra. And the second objective is how are the Arctic and Antarctica different? So if you pause the video here and press play when you've written the title and date. Okay, so the areas that we are looking at are the areas in pinky purple or purpley blue and white on this map. Polar areas and a lot of the tundra biome and the polar biome can be classed as wilderness areas. So on this map here, wilderness areas are indicated in green. So a lot of the hot deserts are wilderness areas. Some large parts of the tropical rainforest biomes are in Brazil, for example, but also mainly polar regions. So wilderness areas are places that they haven't been significantly changed or modified by human activity. And they're places that we do not control or we haven't developed significantly. So as you can imagine, the polar areas are quite harsh environments for humans to live in. So not many people live there, which is why they're still classed as wilderness areas. So when we are talking about the polar areas or polar regions, what sort of latitude are we looking at? So just to compare it with the other biomes. So polar regions, the Arctic and Antarctica, can be found 66.5 degrees north and south of the equator. So the North Pole and the South Pole are both at 90 degrees latitude, like a right angle. So 66.5 degrees north, right up to 90, and then vice versa for the southern hemisphere, 66.5 degrees south, right down to 90 degrees at the South Pole. If you have a look at the map at the top left-hand side on this screen, so the Arctic and Antarctica are identified in green on that map. And the map on the right-hand side is showing the Arctic Circle. So the Arctic Circle is that 66.5 degrees line of latitude north. The blue cross is on the North Pole, and all the area in between, the area within the circle, is classed as the Arctic. So we're looking at the areas in purple and white. Okay, so what is the difference between polar and tundra? This is the first objective for the lesson. So there's an image in the middle of the screen here with some information around it about the tundra biome. The information in the blue bubbles is for the polar biome, so we can compare each characteristic, comparing tundra and polar. So Arctic tundra occurs north of the Arctic Circle and south of the Antarctic Circle. It covers much of Alaska and vast areas of northern Canada and Russia. It is also found along the northern coast of Antarctica. Alpine tundra occurs in mountains around the world at any latitude, but only above the tree line, so only above where trees can grow. If the area above it, there isn't enough water for trees to grow, so it's much more barren, colder, harsher environments. So climate. So the climate in the tundra biome, temperatures can drop in winter to around -20 degrees Celsius. In polar environments, so further towards the North and South Pole, they can drop to up to 50 degrees, -50 degrees Celsius. In tundra areas, we do get some plants, some low growing shrubby flowering plants, such as bearberry and different types of mosses. Sometimes small bushes, but other times, most of the time, it tends to look like it does in the picture on the screen here. In polar regions, we get less plants. Sometimes, on rare occasions, we can get mosses and lichens growing on the fringes of areas where there's ice, but much less vegetation than in tundra regions. So in tundra regions, the soils are frozen. So this is called permafrost, where the soils are frozen throughout the year. In polar regions, they're permanently frozen. So in tundra regions, the soil can melt a little during the summer months, compared to polar regions where it's just permanently frozen further towards the poles. Okay, and animals. So there's more food options. There's more variety in the food chains and food webs in tundra regions. So we do get a larger range of species, a larger range of animals. So animals such as the Arctic fox and the Arctic hare, so giant rabbits. In polar regions, so the north and south, we get less animals. So polar bears in the Arctic and penguins in the southern hemisphere and Antarctica are the main species that we'd identify with the polar biome. What I want you to do now is to pause the video here and to either write down 2 facts about tundra environments and 2 facts about polar environments, or move straight to the stretch activity and write 1 to 2 sentences contrasting each of the characteristics for both these environments. So spend up to 5 minutes completing this task. Press pause and press play when you've done that. Okay, so we have completed the first objective for this lesson. We have investigated the difference between polar and tundra. So now let's move on to have a look at the Arctic and Antarctica and why they're different. Well, we'll have to look at some of the similarities and the differences. So you might already have a good idea about the characteristics of the Arctic, the nature of the Arctic compared to the nature of Antarctica. Just think about what you already know about these places. Okay, so the Arctic is a polar region spread across 3 continents. It's a region compared to Antarctica, which is a continent in itself. So the Arctic is comprised of countries within the 3 continents of Europe, North America, and Asia. Both these places, the Arctic and Antarctica, receive very little rainfall. If you want to think back to this global atmospheric circulation model that we looked at in lesson 2 of the Living World, the reason that they receive very little rainfall is because there's very high pressure at the poles. So cold air is sinking. So when the air sinks, there's no air in the atmosphere to condense into rainfall. High pressure, the air's sinking. The skies are relatively clear. So there's no real cloud formation or significant cloud formation for large parts of the year. Okay, a little bit more information about the Arctic. So as we know, the Arctic is bordered by the Arctic Circle, 66.5 degrees north of the equator. So this line is defined as the area along the line has one day each year where the sun never rises and one day where the sun never sets. So further north of this line, the days get longer the days get longer in summer and the nights get longer in winter. So at the North Pole, 6 months of the year are in total daylight, the sun never sets, and then 6 months of the year is in darkness. So the Arctic is a frozen ocean, there's no land underneath the main part of the Arctic Sea. As you can see on the picture on the right hand side, in the Arctic Circle there's actually 8 countries, or parts of 8 countries within that circle, but the actual sea that freezes over doesn't have any land underneath it compared to Antarctica, which does. Okay. Unofficially, the Arctic can be defined as north of the tree line. So the tree line, if you have a look at the area that's circled in red on the map, that's the boreal forest, or sometimes called taiga. So that's a biome, and it looks a little bit like the pictures at the bottom of the screen here. So coniferous trees, like pine trees, Christmas trees. So sometimes we can think of the Arctic as being north of this line. So where the trees stop, further north, the trees don't grow because there's not enough water in the ground. It's permanently frozen, or frozen for large parts of the year. So sometimes we can define the Arctic as above this tree line. And 5 million people live in the Arctic. Antarctica, as we know, 66.5 degrees south of the equator. In the same way as the Arctic, the sun never sets in summer and it doesn't rise again in winter. Antarctica is a continent of land mass, so there's land underneath the ice. It's covered in an ice sheet. When this ice sheet meets the sea, it's called an ice shelf. So it's like forming a shelf over the sea from the land. It's not breaking off. If it breaks off, that's just an iceberg. 60 times the size of the UK, really, really big. Sometimes, the ice on the land can be several kilometres deep. In the Arctic, because the Arctic's just a frozen sea, the sea ice is only several meters thick. So a real big difference in the thickness of the ice between the Arctic and Antarctica. Antarctica doubles in size in the winter months. So Antarctica doubles in size. The Arctic Ocean more than doubles in size in winter. So they're both expanding in winter and shrinking in summer. And Antarctica is the coldest, windiest, and least populated of the world's continents. It's often described as the last great wilderness. So your main task for this lesson, what you need to do is create a Venn diagram for the Arctic and Antarctica. So you'll need to use either a double page in your exercise book, so equivalent of an A4 piece of paper, or roughly equivalent, slightly bigger, or just an A4 piece of paper. Make a copy of the circles and the Venn diagram here. Don't add the information in red, you can add the information in blue. So hopefully everyone's done a Venn diagram before in a different subject. The two bubbles overlap, and the area in between, you're going to write similarities for Antarctica and Antarctica. So your example here is both defined as 66.5 degrees north or south. They've got the same line of latitude, it's just in a different hemisphere. For the Arctic, home to 5 million people, so that information that just applies to the Arctic compared to Antarctica. The information we've got here is no permanent inhabitants. There are scientists that live there, but they're not permanent inhabitants. They don't live there all year. Your success criteria, your work needs to be neat and tidy. You need to include the information in this video, include a minimum of 3 pieces of information in each section, so each section of the diagram, and a wide range of information. If your target is confidence, you need to produce a detailed comparison. So a minimum of 4 pieces of information in each section. Aim for 4 rather than 3, and make your information detailed. If your target is secure, you need a clear comparison, a minimum of 3 pieces in each. So you might include a little bit of detail, some of the statements might not be particularly detailed. And if your target is emerging, developing, basic information with added extras if you can. So aim for 3 in each section. The stretch activity is to carry out some additional research about water salinity or water saltiness in both of these places, and also find out about the indigenous populations. Add this information to your diagram. So you will spend about 10-15 minutes, up to 15 minutes on this task. Pause the video here and press play when you've done that. Okay, so we have completed both objectives. And finally, what I want you to do is to speak to somebody. It might not be right now this second, you might save it for later, save it for when you're talking over the dinner table later possibly. Talk to someone at home or a family member or friend and tell them what you've learned today. Have a conversation about it and inform them of something that maybe you didn't know at the start of this lesson before you started your Venn diagram. Next lesson, we will move on to look at how humans are seeking a sustainable future for polar environments. And there's just a little bit of information there in that green box about the final few lessons of the Living World topic. The lesson in bold, lesson 4, you will need to submit your work. So the work that you're doing up to then, it's important, hold on to it, and you will submit your work in lesson 4. If anyone's looking for an extension activity, there's an extension sheet on Satchel 1. So I will see you next lesson.